I want to talk about inequality, ecology, sustainable development from a global perspective, and start with a very basic but fundamental thought about what sustainable development would mean. If you take a strong concept of sustainability, so what we call strong sustainability, then it matters on the one hand to provide, let's say, decent living conditions for all people who live on the planet, while at the same time respecting ecological and environmental limits. So simple, so good. This is reflected, for example, in the Sustainable Development Indicators that many of you will know. So you have goals such as the reduction of poverty, of hunger, quality education, so a range of socio-economic goals on the one hand, and also a range of environmental and ecological goals on the other hand, climate action, water safety, and so on. But unfortunately, it seems to be very difficult to pursue all of these goals at the same time, so that nowadays we speak of trade-offs between these different goals. If we want to take an empirical look at that and start with the ecological side, then a good starting point would be the planetary boundaries framework that many of you will certainly know. A framework developed by climate researchers and other natural scientists to say that there are several boundaries in terms of ecology and environment that we should rather not transgress in order to secure safe living conditions for mankind on the planet. And this includes, of course, CO2 concentration in the context of climate change, but also aspects of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and other environmental aspects. And this framework has been combined with the socio-economic part of sustainability in a framework that many of you will also know, the Donut framework by Kate Raworth, which is a nice visualization, I think, of how the two sides can come together. On the inner circle, we have several social foundations, minimum standards, basic needs, such as food, water, access to equity, and so on. And the idea of this donut is that we wanna strive in the inner circle of the donut in terms of meeting these social minimum standards while not exceeding the planetary boundaries. And if we manage to find a good balance between both, then we would be in what is called the safe operating space for humanity. So the idea of finding a good balance between both is fundamental and nicely conveyed, I think, in this donut. Now, this concept has been brought to empirical data by a team of researchers in Leeds, and you can have a look at their project on their website and play around with their data. So they took the planetary boundary indicators for a 2 degrees warming goal, and combined this with the socioeconomic part, while of course making some maybe subjective decisions about what are acceptable minimum thresholds in terms of socioeconomic living standards. Then they brought this to empirical data, and what you would see if you compare different countries is typically 2 types of scenarios. One, as in the case of Germany on the left-hand side, where a country meets basic minimum standards of living, defined for a global level. You may even argue that they are even lowly defined, but they achieve these goals while transgressing planetary boundaries massively. On the other hand, you have countries that live within their planetary boundaries, but they fall short of even meeting very lowly defined socioeconomic standards of living. And if you take a global perspective, you will see that there seems to be something like a trade-off. So what you see on this graph is the same data expressed in a ratio where 1 expresses the boundaries. So on the y-axis, the social scale, 1 would be the level of where you meet the the minimum standards of socioeconomic living conditions, and you want to be above 1. On the environmental physical axis, it's the opposite. 1 is the threshold of planetary boundaries, and you want to be below. So you would ideally like to be on the upper left corner, and you see there's lots of space, because no country apparently manages to find a good balance in this trade-off. These are data from 2015. If you go back, then you would find that, I think, 10 years earlier, at some point, Costa Rica or Cuba were kind of approaching this area, but it's largely empty. And it seems to be the case that as countries move on in terms of improving living conditions, they very quickly exceed planetary boundaries. Now, so far, so bad, you may say, but you also see that there's quite some variation. And so, for example, if you compare this group of countries, these countries achieve more or less comparable standards of living, but they require different levels of ecological resources, of use of resources, of emissions to achieve this, right? So they are quite on different places on the x-axis. Or if you want to look at it from the other side, you could compare this group of countries and say, well, they all have similar levels of transgression of planetary boundaries, or they do not transgress, actually it's the same comparable level of use of environmental resources and so on, but the level of living standards that they achieve on average for their populations is quite diverse. And so the question that we ask in a joint project with my co-author Martin Medelanes is, does income and wealth inequality has any role to play in explaining this variation? From a theoretical perspective, there would be good reasons to assume that inequality might be important somehow. So if you think about it in very simple terms, you could say, and if you take for granted that economic activity is correlated with CO2 emissions and so on, as it currently is, then you could say the easiest way to guarantee minimum standards at the lowest possible level of environmental degradation is to take the fruits of economic activity and just distribute it evenly across the population, and then that's it. But the literature has, of course, made other arguments, most of them political economy types of arguments. It has been argued that more unequal societies have a harder time in terms of the diffusion of technologies, for example, technologies that would make economic activity and consumption more environmentally friendly. And public policy solutions could be more difficult because more wealthy people could have vested interests, be engaged in carbon-intensive production, and so on and so forth. You could imagine that economic and social problems are simply more important in the public sphere in more unequal societies. You could think of protest and acceptance of climate policies and so on. Or you could also think of status consumption. Several papers, some of them authored by people in this room, I think, have shown that status consumption is more impactful in more unequal societies. There have also been made arguments going in the other direction, I should say. So some people have also argued that it could be the other way around. Actually, maybe inequality could be helpful for the environment, because you could imagine that higher incomes or higher levels of wealth have lower propensities to consume and to emit. Some people have also argued that that richer people are more aware of ecological problems and so on. These are arguments that are maybe more about levels than about distribution, but anyway, they have been made. You could debate them, but let's just take it as it is for the moment. If you look at some data and some graphs that many of you will also know, you could also get the idea that inequality could be a problem for managing this trade-off. So this is data from Lucas Chancel that show that, so this is about per capita CO2 emissions, and you see, as we all know, that higher income countries have higher absolute levels of emissions, but also that there's a huge variation within countries in terms of how much people emit. You would see, for example, that the the richest 10% in Latin America have higher CO2 emissions than the bottom half in North America, which is otherwise the most carbon-intensive region, and so on and so forth. This is a graph from a nice paper by Oswald Owen and Steinberger that also, suggests a similar direction. It shows it compares the energy intensity of different consumption goods and the elasticity. So the idea being that there are goods that people consume at higher levels of income and wealth, and these goods also happen to be more energy intensive. So there's something that they call luxury goods, things that people consume at high levels of income and wealth, and there are vehicles, holidays, so related to mobility and so on, goods that are very energy intensive. And all of these data would probably suggest that inequality could be problematic for the environment. But then there's also empirical literature that explicitly investigates the relationship of inequality and environment, sustainability, and this literature looks quite different. So this literature is larger than just these 4 papers, but these 4 papers are, I think, the most recent ones investigating a global perspective on this question. They use different time spans and different countries, but otherwise they are quite comparable, different techniques. But they are interested in similar things. And they find, so the first one finds that they all use the, as an inequality indicator, a Gini coefficient of disposable income. And the first paper finds that a reduction in the Gini coefficient, so lower inequality, comes along with higher CO2 emissions in low countries, so quite the other way around. In high income countries, higher inequality seems to be, lower inequality seems to be beneficial in terms of CO2 emissions, at least. But then there are 2 other papers who rather find that a reduction of inequality coincides with higher CO2 emissions again, and so this looks quite different. Now, how can we make sense of this, or how can we bring this forward? Let me go back to the question that my co-author and I are interested in, this very simple cross-sectional question. And again, so what we're asking or what we're interested in is whether inequality has a role to play in managing the trade-off, right? So what we do, using similar data, countries, time spans, and so on, is a very, very simple OLS regression with time fixed effects. The only thing we really do is to take care of the standard errors, but otherwise we simply ask if the degree of the transgression of planetary boundaries, taking the data that you already saw, can somehow be related with the degree of inequality that a country experiences, comparing countries of the same socioeconomic living standards. And what we do vary a lot is the indicator of inequality. We do work with the same Gini that the other people used, but we use post-tax and market Gini. And then we also look at income shares and wealth shares that are available from the World Income Database. So we can compare pre-tax, wealth, post-tax income, and so on. And what we do in the second equation is that we vary the income share of the bottom 10%, of the bottom 50%, and so on. But not only that, we hold constant various other shares of the distribution to see, to understand a little bit where a higher income share of the bottom 10%, for example, comes from. I think this will become easier to understand once we look at some of the results. So this is for low-income countries where we don't have post-tax and disposable income tax data, so we just look at pre-tax income here. And if you want to look at the upper left corner, what you will see in the graph is the beta coefficients from the estimation, where we ask, at comparable levels of socioeconomic development, what does it mean for the transgression of inequality, of planetary boundaries when the bottom 10 income share is higher or lower? And we have this negative coefficient here, and it's really a purely descriptive exercise. We have this negative coefficient here, which means that a higher bottom 10 income share is associated with lower degree of transgression of planetary boundaries. And the same for the bottom 50 share of the distribution. If we look at the pre-tax income share of the middle 40, so percentile 50 to 90, it turns around. It looks quite different. And we continue with this exercise, and don't worry, I don't want to take you through all of these results. Rather, what we saw and what we found interesting here, that the picture that we obtain through this exercise is much more nuanced than just looking at the Gini coefficient. So if we just do the same exercise with the Gini coefficient, and of course, I mean, it's a single score indicator, it's not the Gini's fault, we obtain this negative coefficient, which would tell us that countries that experience a higher Gini a higher inequality, low-income countries would experience lower degree of transgression of planetary boundaries, which is quite different from the picture that we obtain when we look at specific points along the distribution. So we did the same for high-income countries and middle-income countries, but so I don't want to take you through all of these results, obviously. Rather, so to synthesize this, more than we should, just to give you an idea of the variety of results, we find something like that. And you should really take the synthesis with a grain of salt because it's oversimplified. But we would say that in low-income countries, for the only indicator that we can look at, pre-tax income, it seems that the part of the distribution that we associate with higher transgression of planetary boundaries is the middle class, defined as the middle 40. So when this group obtains a higher share of income, we have this descriptive finding. It's very different in middle-income countries where we do not replicate the pre-tax result, even though the data is there. But it seems that post-tax income is an indicator where we do find results, and there it's the bottom half that we associate with higher transgression of planetary boundaries. Now, we do not want to engage in interpreting this in any way. Rather, what we really think is important is that the picture that we obtain, as I said, by looking at the data in this way, is very different from just looking at the Gini coefficient or other single score indicators. And this leads us to the conclusion, and I said I wanted to talk about the research agenda and think about all the things that we do not know and how we could approach them, that much of the literature that we have produces results that are sometimes contradictory and sometimes difficult to make sense of, and this could, we think, improve by investigating more what are the shifts in the distribution and what are the shares that different parts along the distribution obtain, and then try to understand this. This would also help with a misunderstanding that some papers of this literature share, and this is that they equate a reduction in the Gini lower inequality with pro-poor growth. So you would read many papers that say, well, we have a reduction in inequality, this is probably because of pro-poor growth. So income growth at the bottom half or somewhere at the lower half of the distribution. And the other way around, when the Gini increases, they say, oh, this is because the richest became richer. But of course, many different dynamics can be behind changes in the Gini coefficient, and it's not always clear what causes a change in this indicator. Another important takeaway that we think is that the literature has focused on post-tax income, which is reasonable if you want to think about consumption, but results are impossible to replicate with pre-tax data, and it would probably be interesting to think about the differences and try to understand them. And then consider country circumstances, differentiate countries of different income levels, which parts of the literature do. What would be important in our view, and what we think we can see from the admittedly very simple exercise that I showed you, is that it's important to do all of this at the same time. So it could be, for example, that wealth inequality could be relevant to different degrees at different points along the distribution in different types of countries because they have different income levels, and because, that's the crucial point, different mechanisms are at play or are not at play. And I want to conclude with a note on policy implications. Maybe the most important takeaway for me from looking at this literature is that it's very important and very basic, but very important to reflect much more on the nexus between level and distribution. I already told you that sometimes levels and distribution and dynamics in the distribution get mixed up. We saw this in the theoretical arguments when these things sometimes get conflated. And I think this is also a big problem in terms of policy implications. So the policy implications that many people have drawn from the empirical studies that apparently find a trade-off between inequality reduction measured through the Gini and environmental protection is that we can either have pro-poor growth, reduction in inequality, or we can protect the environment and have fewer CO2 emissions. But if you look at if you take a share perspective, this is not very convincing. Then you could also argue, and if you think that pro-poor income growth or generally income growth at the lower half of the distribution is something that you would want to defend, you could say, you can take the share perspective and look which additional environmental degradation do you actually obtain. And then you could also reach the conclusion that if it is the case that income growth on the bottom half is a problem for the environment, then the conclusion is not necessarily that income inequality reduction is a problem. Rather, it could be the other way around, that more redistribution and more reduction in inequality, but at the top of the distribution, could be a very effective policy solution for reconciling inequality reduction in the terms of income growth at the bottom and less environmental degradation. This will not probably solve the whole trade-off that we observe, but it could be a step in the right direction. Thank you.